Dajit Cade Mila Falcha. Welcome to Irish Granny Tarot. Time to do our book, and I'm really excited about this book. I read it when it first came out, 2017. Remember the library? And I'm astounded that I don't remember more of the real gritty facts of it. I think I just absorbed and 100% kind of internalized a lot of the larger messages of it, but some of the specific details blew my mind again. So it was kind of fun to get that second little exciting introduction to it. What am I talking about? Talking about Surviving Death by Leslie Kean is how it's pronounced. And I apologize to everybody who thought my video the other day talking to the past or talking to I can't remember now exactly how. Talking to the other side was really about how to discuss life and issues with how to find common ground with people who are close to you with opposing political beliefs. Lots of positive feedback that it was helpful. I'm so grateful. I feel like I'm always dumping terrible news, and it's difficult to find useful things that we can do. So this is something we can do. And, even if you're only making a difference one-on-one in your own little world, that's why we're here. So I'm really grateful. Thank you for letting me know. I'm glad you guys appreciated it. To the one or two people who were bummed out that it wasn't like this book, I tried to explain it was my own private little amusement that I was making a pun intentionally because I knew this book was coming up. Nobody got it but me. It didn't occur to me that it might disappoint people about the topic of the video. I'm sorry, but you won't be disappointed. This book is going to blow your mind. I absolutely 100% promise you. I want to hear, if it doesn't blow your mind, it means you've already read it. So, and I'd already read it and it blew my mind a second time. Before we start, I'd like to point out, you may have noticed my beautiful bouquet of flowers here. So I'd like to brag, if you'll indulge me for a moment. There was a knock on my door this morning, and it was the floral delivery. Oh, always happy to see them. The only other person you want to see come to your house is Santa Claus, So this is a gift from my daughters. I have 5 daughters. They conspired. And it was my birthday a couple of weeks ago, and I thought, they dawned on them. We've talked about it, so it's not like they completely ignored it. They wished me happy, but that's not an issue. But I thought maybe one of them started feeling kind of guilty and sent me some flowers just anyway. I totally forgot that tomorrow is Mother's Day. I'm thinking of a little something to do for tomorrow, so you can keep an eye out unless something terrible happens. So this is from my daughters, and it came with a card. First of all, florists name their bouquets. This bouquet is known as Starry Night, so I can legitimately brag that my children gave me a Van Gogh for Mother's Day. Beat that. Second, it included a card, and on the card it's a running joke in our family because we watched a lot of movies with our children when they were growing up, and one of our family favorites is with Faye Dunaway as Joan Crawford, Mommy Dearest, based on the autobiographical book by her adopted daughter, Christine Crawford. And I point out that she's adopted, not to make an unnecessary distinction, but to point to the fact that her adopting children was actually almost performative, which is kind of unfair because she had huge issues, Joan Crawford did. And this book was not flattering. So we used to joke in our house, I taught them when they were little, they would say, "We love you, Mommy Dearest," which is what Joan Crawford trained her children to say in public for the cameras. So when things got a little tense, they'd say, "We love you, Mommy dearest." And then my response was always, "No more wire hangers." And if you've read the book or seen the movie, you get your amusement where you can. What can I say? So, Leslie Kean, looks like Kean, but I do believe it's pronounced Kane, but we know who she is a journalist and an investigative journalist of the highest order, well respected in the field of journalism and literary field in general. And I believe she worked for the New York Times. And she wrote this book after an interesting process in her life. Years before, she had an assignment to do an article for the newspaper on UFOs, which led to this book. And I would recommend this book if you haven't read this book, or if there are people in your life who are open to the idea but a little resistant to the reality of it. This is a seminal work because she interviewed astronauts. She interviewed military high, like the head of the Belgian Air Force, people who were big shots in militaries around the world. She interviewed many commercial pilots, private pilots, and people who worked for the government. And as this said, they went on record and they talked with her about their brush with UFOs, photographs. You know how I love a book with photographs. See, look, these are some of the serious looking fellows she interviewed, and they were willing to go public, which is really difficult. In the process of writing that book, she met many people involved in the UFO world. And one of the more prominent ones was a man called Bud Hopkins from the East Coast. He is a famous artist. He's got paintings in museums. I mean, very respected in the art world. Who came out with his own experience with ET contact. Faced the same amount of ridicule, you know the drill. And went on to write this book. It's the only book is his I have. The rest I got from the library. This is a very interesting event that maybe we should cover. We'll see. If I run out of ideas, we'll go to this book because it's very good. So Leslie and Bud fell in love. He was divorced. I don't know what her background was. They had a relationship. I read somewhere, I thought that they lived together. I could be wrong about that, but she was his partner until he died. And he died not too long ago, and he was in his 80s. And he figures in this book in a very dramatic way. So this book is a journalist investigates evidence for an afterlife. For all of you who were disappointed the other day. And you are going to be mind blown. So let's get right down to it. Surviving Death by Leslie Kean. Initially, she was a doubter. She was a skeptic. She's a journalist, show me the proof. And while she started to explore, and she did a hugely deep dive into it, for evidence of an afterlife, she saw things personally, witnessed things herself that supposedly were completely impossible according to science. And her conclusion eventually was that there are parts of nature that are neither understood nor accepted. And we're on a journey of learning about the world we live in, and we are as ignorant as the people who laughed at von Leeuwenhoek when he told them there were animals in that tiny drop of water when he invented the microscope. Galileo, Copernicus, Bruni, who was burned at the stake. These people very bravely came out and bucked a very resistant and fundamentalist religious system. She doesn't face quite that level because she is so well established. And they included this in a series. I'll try to remember. It's either Netflix or Amazon or Hulu. Those are the only three things I have. So it's a multi-episodic documentary style coverage of the topics in this book, and it's very, very good. So she started out this investigation 100% a skeptic, but a journalist, keeping her mind open, and at the end, well, you'll see what happens. She feels that the research she did and the evidence she saw, and many people have said to me, there's no proof for any of this stuff. This is, kind of, not in a bad way, but sort of implying, I'll believe it when I see it, and in the meantime, it's foolish to believe it when you can't see it. Wait till you hear this. This is just unbelievable. She says that what they discovered suggests that there are some aspects of consciousness that may survive after death. Don't turn this off. Hear us out. This is very interesting. She says she's not just a detached observer because while she was doing her journalistic observations and recording what was going on, she had personal experiences that she also puts in the book that blew her mind. She said she has an obligation to tell because it was part of the story, part of her investigation. And she also felt an obligation to try to remain uninvolved, but she got drawn in inadvertently. So in 2007, she was the associate producer of a documentary on life after death. And in the process of doing that, so I guess the documentary came first, and then she wrote the book. She met a 3-year-old who remembered a past life and took them, in making the documentary, to his previous home. She went to a place in Skull, England, where they were doing, it's an estate, and they're doing experiments there with mediums. And the mediums apparently facilitated manifestations of lights, moving objects, materializing hands. Just wait, that's nothing. Images on sealed photographic film that had never been opened, witnessed by hundreds of people. And this is from 1993 to 1998. They were scrutinized for 3 years by 3 outside investigators, these particular mediums that she has in the book. And she was the one who documented the events for her investigative piece. Became a documentary. She sees value in the diminishing potency of rigid belief systems. If we could develop a broad, unified view of reality of life and death based on facts, we might have more harmony. So interesting, this hard-boiled investigative journalist eventually ended up talking about metaphysical things in relationship to these investigations. And she says, she makes a point of saying, this has nothing to do with religion or scientific dogma. She said, this is what happened with no spin being put on it. And then people are asked for their opinions, and opposing opinions are discussed. So it's a very open-minded book. The first opinion or theory would be the survival hypotheses, that the dead live on in some form after their physical life and that they, on their own volition, can communicate with the living. That's one theory. Interestingly, now this is the part that is most people don't know, lots of people won't agree with. Wait till you hear what happens in the book. There's strong academic and scientific foundation to argue the truth of this theory. And it's been the subject of debate in many disciplines for a very long time. And what I had forgotten, and we'll talk more about it, is it is presently, today, being studied under scientific controlled conditions on several different university campuses and funded by the National Institute of Health. This is not woo-woo. She's collected 10 leading experts to contribute to the book. So what she does is she discusses something in one chapter, and in the next chapter, the leading expert writes his or her own essay about it. Then she moves to the next. Survival, the notion of survival of the soul of the person, the essence of the person with the personality, memories, etc., after the death of the physical body, doesn't necessarily mean that you're becoming one with universal consciousness or merging with awareness. It's equivalent to the individual, personal, survival, post-mortem existence of traits, memories, and emotions. Not putting a religious spin on this, trying to remain neutral. It's psychological continuity after death of the body. It's the survival of the individual essence. You can call it the soul, you can call it the spirit. There's no 100% acceptable terminology for it because it depends on your point of view, your context. But she says she has witnessed, and there is much documentation of PSI, psi abilities. That's paranormal abilities. Telepathy, telekinesis, clairvoyance, mediumship, psychic ability. So from now on, when I say psi ability, it's one or all of those things. Psychic functioning, ESP, getting information without using your 5 senses that we acknowledge. It's the collective 6th sense. Telepathy, clairvoyance, psychokinesis, precognition, and any or one or all of those things can help us to connect with the dead. Some people are better at it than others. It's probably an ability that everybody has, and in some people it hasn't been tapped down. There has been, now this is interesting, most, if you turn on the television and they talk about ghosts or Uri Geller bending spoons or any number of paranormal stuff, it's always with the tone of ridicule. It's always joshing around. Nobody's taking it seriously. She says that's really unfair. That's mind control. She said there's over 100 years of repeated scientific research that has documented this. Endless documentation we're going to look at. However, mainstream science doesn't accept it. And for all the reasons that they don't accept a lot of things. And historically, mainstream science for hundreds and thousands of years has rejected new ideas, shakes up the status quo. And we don't understand it. We don't know how this stuff works, but we also don't know how gravity works. We don't know how dark energy works. And science accepts them. So that's an interesting perspective. Science absolutely does not understand the nature of consciousness. Scientist Dr. Dean Radin is the leading scientific authority on psi phenomena, clairvoyance, psychic ability, etc., etc. And he said, see, I think I need my glasses. Blind day. With a doctorate in educational psychology. Okay, so interestingly enough, these people who are her experts are embraced in their particular field as being genuinely good scientists, not con artists, at the top of the information that does exist, the understanding that does exist. These guys are legit, is what I'm saying. So, with a doctorate in educational psychology, he's chief scientist at the Institute of Noetic Sciences in Petaluma, California, and has held appointments at Princeton, and he has also worked within a classified program now known as Stargate, investigating psychic phenomena for the U.S. government. This is what he says. The reality of psychic phenomena is now no longer based solely upon faith or wishful thinking or absorbing anecdotes on TV. It is not even based upon the results of a few scientific experiments. Instead, we know these phenomena exist because of new ways of evaluating massive amounts of scientific evidence collected over a century by scores of researchers. British psychologist David Fontana studied the evidence for psi for over 30 years. Quote, psychic abilities are a matter of fact, not belief, he writes. What they are and they mean for our view of reality is another matter, but one cannot dismiss them as fiction and yet retain credibility as an unbiased observer. The reader will encounter the reality of the most refined psychic functioning throughout this book, and by the end will have no question as to its existence. And I 100% guarantee you, if you accept the understanding that this woman is a legitimate journalist and that the evidence discussed has been vetted and controlled for fraud, you will have your mind blown. So to believe this idea of survivalism, one must accept as true other auxiliary assumptions, which are unprovable and untestable, but there you go. You have to assume that some people who die, at least some, have memories and personal characteristics they've brought from their physical existence, that the dead intend to communicate with us, that they have the psychic ability, whatever it is, the power to communicate with us, that they know what's happening in our reality, and that they are allowed by their situation to find someone through whom they can communicate like a medium. To believe any more of the psi evidence, you have to accept these assumptions. Or another thing, another way to look at it is, can psi phenomena be explained in a different way? Mediums are interacting either directly with the dead, that's the survival theory, or the other way to look at it is mediums are hyper-tuned psychic ability, and they're actually telepathically interacting with the living. And to assume that the living they're interacting with must have some knowledge that the mediums bring forward as information from the dead. Think about that a second, it makes sense. Psi abilities exist only in, you have to assume, the other thing is that psi abilities only exist in gifted persons and don't connect with the afterlife of the dead. They exist between two living persons, one calling him or herself a medium, the other the person called the sitter, who comes, like the patient, who comes asking, please connect to my dead father, that person. And this is called the living agent hypothesis, that all the information is coming from earthbound psychic ability. So those are the two main theories. The two main theories that are not all about religion or whatever. No scientific theory that exists, and this is accepted in the scientific world, no scientific theory that exists renders any form of psi phenomena improbable. What that is saying is scientists do not, bad science to discount something because you can't explain it. Fundamental rule of science. You can't say, well, that makes no sense. It's not true. That's bad science. That makes no sense. We need to investigate it. We need more evidence. So that's proper science. Scientists are not able to say that psychic ability is baloney. So according to Stephen Broad from the University of Maryland, who wrote a book called Immortal Remains, The Evidence of Life After Death in 2003. So Immortal Remains, 2003. May want to read that. He assures us that these cases have been vetted to rule out fraud, errors, misreporting, dishonesty, mental illness, and in his book, which is a good-sized book, he said those are only some of the cases, the cream of the crop. There are many, many more cases. Some people didn't want to be in the book. Some were a little more vague maybe, or repeated. Like there was one that was a sterling example of a situation and 50 more like it, but they took the best one. So part 1 of the book is their life before birth. Chapter 1 is called Airplane Crash on Fire. So, as we know from Dr. Ian Stevenson from the books by Dr. Peter Fenwick, from all those books we've done the past few months, Dr. Brian Weiss, books on reincarnation and past life regression, that there are many cases of children with memories of their past lives that manifest as nightmares and phobias. And the perfect example, which I'm sure now everybody's heard about, I have the book, I'll dig it out here, it's called Soul Survivor, is the case of James Leininger, a 2-year-old. His mother was a ballerina with San Francisco Ballet and the American Ballet Theater. Her name is Andrea. His dad was a director of human resources for the Lafayette Parish Schools in Louisiana. And his name is Bruce, and he was strongly evangelical. They're still alive, but the book was written a while ago. So the dad, when James was not quite 2, so he hasn't even, like 18 months old, took him to the Flight Museum in, I believe it was Dallas. And the kid just freaked out over a World War II F-104. That's a kind of plane. And they were like, what's with this kid? But, your children do things all the time that make you think, oh, okay. So later, his mother took him to the store and bought him a little plastic plane and said, oh, look, James. It's one of those molded plastic planes about this big. Said, look, James, it has a bomb under it. And barely able to talk, because he's just turned 2, he goes, well, that's not a bomb. That's a drop tank. A drop tank. And his mother's like, okay, and she went home and looked it up and found out that a drop tank was an extra gas tank that was attached to the bottom of certain planes during World War II. So how did a 2-year-old know this? I didn't know this. I'm considerably older than 2 years old. So they took him back to this museum of flight, and he became obsessed in the meantime with toy planes. And he seemed to have just incredible detailed knowledge of World War II planes. And at this point, he was 25 months old. He started having terrible, terrible nightmares. Really awful nightmares. Let me read here what this says. So I stood in my son's doorway. James was lying on his back, kicking and clawing the covers of his crib. He's still in a crib. He's a baby. Like he was trying to break his way out of a coffin. He flung his head back and forth, screaming over and over, airplane crash on fire, little man, can't get out. James had just turned 2 and was beginning to learn to talk in sentences, yet his words seemed so unchildlike in their desperation. Airplane crash on fire, little man can't get out. My concern was to protect him, but I felt frightened and paralyzed. What was happening to my son? And they asked, son, what happened to your plane? And he said it crashed on fire. And why did your plane crash? It got shot. Who shot your plane? James cocked his head and looked at me like the answer was obvious. It seemed to strike him as so inane that he rolled his eyes and said the Japanese with disdain like an impatient teenager. He was only just 2. His father says it felt as if the air had been sucked out of the room. So one day, dropping Bruce, the husband, off for a plane at the airport, James got all agitated that his father's plane was going to crash and catch on fire. So let's see here. Did I already read you this? They were reading him a book about something, I don't know, and he started spontaneously talking about plane crashes. They asked him more details after he said it was the Japanese who shot this plane down. And he said that he himself had flown an airplane called a Corsair. He also said that his plane took off from a boat. His dad asked him about the name of the boat, and he said, Natoma. Bruce commented that the name sounded Japanese, but James assured his parents it was American, once again with an annoyed look as if they were idiots. So the dad's writing about the memory of this, and he's just like can't believe this. He says, I went onto the internet later, and after reading several pages of hits on the word Natoma, I stared at a black and white picture of the Natoma Bay, a small United States aircraft carrier that fought in the Pacific in World War II. Andrea came in and I showed her as we stood there, stiffly frozen as the hair stood up on the backs of our necks. And the child once again mentioned past life, and my wife and her family wondered about a possible past life, and the husband, because he was so evangelical, said, never, not in my house. I needed to be right about this. My spiritual side was ruled by the Christian faith, which did not accept reincarnation. I might add, anymore. It used to. And that was the end of that story. And the world was a rational place controlled by the scientific method. There had to be a logical explanation. So James, the pilot, had a best friend. James said that he had a best friend named Jack Larson. He said that his plane was shot in the front, in the engine where the propeller was. So they bought a book, and the book was for the grandfather, and the father, Bruce, was paging through this book. James came over and saw a photo of Iwo Jima and said, oh, that's where my plane was shot down. And somehow Bruce got the notion that the person that got shot down was the friend Jack Larson, and that he was the dead pilot. So he started researching the name Jack Larson, and he discovered that the aircraft carrier, the Natoma Bay, had been at Iwo Jima. And James had insisted that his own plane was a Corsair, but they talked to a veteran of that battle and asked about a Corsair, and the veteran said there were no Corsairs that flew off of the Natoma. So Bruce felt that this was proof that this whole thing was nonsense. There was no reincarnation. He could go back to being Christian. However, the vet had known a guy called Jack Larson, and wanted to know, where did you hear that name? Haven't thought of that guy in a really long time. So James started having fewer nightmares when his parents got advice from a counselor, a child psychologist, of how to deal with them. But this stuff kept filtering into his daily life. He turned his Halloween pumpkin into an F-16 Thunderbird. I don't even know what that is. In the spring of 2001, he began to draw tons and tons about what he called his memories. They were all battle scenes. They had planes in fire going into the sea. He signed them James 3. And they said, but you're not 3, you just turned 2. And he'd say, oh, it's because I'm the third James. They're like, okay. So a child expert said this sort of drawing the same thing over and over, it's a compulsion repetition, and it's what children do who have trauma. It's post-traumatic play. The kids are trying to work through their trauma. I'm sure everyone's seen video. A child's been through something terrible, they've seen somebody killed or whatever. They've suffered abuse, and they'll have them draw, and they have analyzed so many of these pictures. They even know when the kids choose a certain color, or they do something specific with the sky. They don't have to draw death and monsters and stuff. A lot of it is sort of symbolic, but they understand that kids in trauma can work it out through art therapy. If you hear that, I don't know, we've never had a tornado or a hurricane, but I'm beginning to wonder. Stormy. It's always stormy these days. So this drawing all these pictures, and this is really cute. There's a picture in the book, if I can find it. It's so cute. Right here. He went into his father's office, into the closet of the office, and he created for himself, at the age of about 2.5, he created the cockpit of an airplane for himself. And in this picture, you'll see him with a helmet on, and I'll explain that in a little while. But he got an old car seat and a toy and made himself a cockpit of a plane in the closet. That's just so cute. So, he created the cockpit with the old car seat, and he would pretend to fall out of it, like the way parachutists fall out of an airplane. when they abandon a burning plane. He drew a pilot trapped in a burning plane and pretended to parachute himself. And the psychologist said this is an attempt to resolve some kind of trauma. Did he fall? Eventually, they agreed to do a pilot, not an airplane pilot, a pilot for a new television show called Strange Mysteries. And they agreed to do it. They didn't really want to go public, and they weren't looking to make money. But the company making the video told them, you cooperate with us to do this movie, this pilot, and we will provide you with therapists and counselors for your child. So that, they couldn't really afford it. It's expensive. So that was a good deal. The host was Sherry Belafonte, and she had researched. She wasn't just the hostess. She went and researched this stuff, looked up the Navy pilot Jack Larson, and found one who died in World War II. Tried to find one who died in World War II. The show didn't air, but it was filmed. It eventually didn't get bought up, and it's just sitting somewhere in a box. But they do have it on film, and they've taken that film out and used it. Documents James telling the whole story at the age of 4. James was interviewed saying that Corsairs used to get flat tires all the time and veered to the left on takeoff, so they weren't the most reliable. But his favorite plane was a Corsair. So Sherry did extensive research and showed that this was absolutely true. They had a glitch in their tires. So Bruce went to an annual reunion of the Natoma Bay aircraft carrier crew. He didn't want to live in denial, and this was still kind of haunting the whole family, so he decided to continue to pursue it. At the reunion, he asked the historian of the group about a guy called Jack Larson, and the guy said, "Oh yeah, I know Jack. He lives in Arkansas." And he wasn't even dead. So they got a list from the historian of 21 people who died on the Natoma Bay during this battle. 20 were from 3 different airplane squadrons, and 1 was a guy who worked on the ship itself. And what did they find but a James M. Houston Jr., keep the junior in mind, killed March 3rd, 1945 at the Battle of Iwo Jima, the only airman killed at Iwo Jima. The other were killed in various other battles around that time. He called his wife, and she said, "Oh, James III. Used to be the guy, the pilot who died, James Jr., James II. And then his dad was James I. Does that give you chills?" Bruce felt like it was spiritual warfare going on. He was really tormented by this. It's not fair to laugh. This was really shaking the foundations of what he'd been raised to believe. Veterans told him, hey, there were no Corsairs flown off the Natoma Bay. And actually, James Houston is recorded as having died flying an FM-2. He was killed in an FM-2. So they got in touch with Jack Larson, and he invited them to visit. He was fascinated by this. And he had an old flight logbook from the battle, and it described the whole thing he saw. Larson gave Bruce, that was the kid wearing the headgear, he gave that to Bruce for James, the helmet, the goggles, and the oxygen mask, which I thought was very sweet. He was really taken with little James. James, the kid, went through a kind of grim ceremony when he first got the helmet. He put it on firmly, professionally, slapping on the air bubbles, shaping the fit, as if he were setting out to work. James wore it when he went into his closet cockpit, which he had constructed. He wore it while flying his flight simulator and while watching tapes of the Blue Angels. They bought him a flight simulator. He and that helmet were inseparable. James got 2 G.I. Joes for Christmas, those dolls. He called one Billy. Billy had brown hair. And he called the other one Leon. Leon was a blonde. And he liked them so well that for his birthday, they gave him a third who had red hair. And he called him Walter. They're like, these names, where does he get these names? So he asked they asked him, where did you get those names? And he goes, well, that's who met me when I got to heaven. Okay. Bruce checked the list of dead from the Natoma and found Billy, Leon, and Walter. And they died before James Jr. died. Bruce did an intensive research and verified every single fact that James had made, that he had claimed. He found that James Houston Jr., the pilot who died, had a living sister, and he wrote to her. And she sent him pictures, including James the pilot in a Corsair. It was a special plane, and it was an honor to be trained. It was a huge privilege to be allowed to fly this plane. Only the top of the top, the hand-picked, were specially trained to fly it. James Jr., the pilot, was madly in love with this airplane. He wasn't in it when he was killed, but it was what he usually flew. The father was able to talk to a veteran who saw the James Houston's plane go down into the bay, and he agreed with James III, the little boy. He agreed totally with the description, how it was hit, how it went into flames. In the process of talking to these veterans, Bruce was really surprised that they were very forthcoming about the fact that many had premonitions and paranormal experiences during the war and afterwards. So he took James with him to the next Natoma reunion. And little James, recognized the voice of a vet and told his mom it made him sad because that guy had been his friend and his voice was old and he was old. Didn't understand why they'd all gotten so old. The vets were shocked by this kid. They could talk to him like he had been at that battle. His depth and breadth of knowledge of the airplanes and the culture of the pilots, and like he had been there. It was just unreal. So at this reunion, they met with James Houston Jr.'s sister. She's quite elderly. Little James walked up to her and called her by her nickname. The only one in the world who ever called her that had been her brother. He told her many personal details about their childhood, and she admitted later that he knew family secrets nobody knew but her and her dead brother. She sent him a painting of James Jr. that her mother had painted, and little James asked, "Where's the painting of you?" No one else knew the mother had painted both of her children, had done 2 paintings. They decided to try to give some sense of finality to little James. So when he was about 8 years old, they went to where this battle site was. They rented a boat. They went to the spot where the crash happened for what they were hoping would be a ceremony of healing for their son. When they got to where it was, they threw a wreath of flowers and some coral into the water. James put his head down in his mother's lap and broke into tears. It was a deep, heart-wrenching sob, as if he were unleashing all the pent-up emotion that had boiled inside his child's body for the past 6 years. He sobbed and wept for 15 minutes. Everyone else on the boat was silent and awestruck by the sight of a little boy in such deep grief. He seemed to be weeping for himself and for James Houston. But he said, when he was finished crying, he said, "I'll never forget you," and saluted. And after that, he didn't forget anything, but he seemed emotionally resolved, healed. So in high school, Leslie Kean met James, and he was old enough to be in high school, and she asked him, "So, you want to join the Navy?" Because he planned to join the Navy when he graduated. You want to join the Navy? Why not the Air Force? And his response was, "Not this time." That's a great story. So, Chapter 2, The Case of James B. How is this possible that starting before 2 years of age, a kid could remember verifiable facts of somebody else's life? Keep in mind, he was really young when this all started. So many facts that it's considered a solved case at the University of Virginia Division of Perceptual Science Studies by Dr. Ian Stevenson. I can't talk today. They have more than 2,500 documented cases, and this is one of them. They have 1,400 like James that they've been able to track down the previous person's life that this child claims to remember. Stevenson retired in 2002. Sadly, he died in 2007, and a Dr. Jim Tucker took over the department. In 2014, Leslie went to the University of Virginia to meet Tucker and to go through his files, look at the cases they were more than happy to share with her. In 2015, she went with Tucker to Columbus, Ohio to meet Luke Ruhlman, a child who had memories of being an African-American woman named Pam who had died while jumping out of a burning building. After speaking with Pam's son, who was still alive, they weren't able to prove or verify that this was a true case. In James' case, interestingly, they had documentation of so much information that was given ages and ages before it became a case and before they started to be researched. They recognize, so I mentioned the one that didn't prove to be true because they don't just embrace every story willy-nilly. They need documented evidence. And the evidence in James' case came at a very young age for him, was verifiable, and appeared before a lot of external influence could have steered them towards fraud. The parents underwent psychological testing and were found to be stable and no undue influence. Usually, and as in the case of Bruce, you find that parents discourage this sort of stuff. They don't want to talk about it. It's like, this is not real. Bruce actively tried to disprove it. But they got 12 established facts before James was even 3 years old. The fact that there was a pilot who had been trapped in a burning plane. The plane had been shot by the Japanese, hit in the front engine by the propeller, crashed into the ocean. The pilot died. He originally flew a Corsair. Corsair did get flat tires. The plane did take off from a boat. The boat was named Natoma. His pilot friend was Jack Larson. The plane crash was near Iwo Jima, and he was, in fact, James number 3. So an opposing argument would be maybe these are really not memories. Maybe this is James and or his parents picking up all this factual stuff psychically. Parents denied that they were psychic. They're like, no, that's the work of the devil. And too much of this stuff was really difficult information to find. I mean, Leslie, Kean, and Bruce the father had a lot of trouble verifying things, not because in the end they were unverifiable. They were verified to be true, but because the process took forever, because it was such arcane information. No, it was obscure. It was in weird places, and they had to go to archives in other states and dig it out. And very few people knew about this. Certainly not people that they had any physical or emotional connection with, like these historians, for example. James didn't talk about, I knew this guy and this is what he told me, or this is what I heard about. He claimed he was that guy. It was the memory of a life he had lived. And according to the child psychologist they consulted, his nightmares seemed like visceral trauma. This seemed very much like a child who had gone through a thing. Dr. Tucker, who took over for Dr. Stevenson, is also a child psychiatrist. And he ruled out pathology. He said, this child's not mentally ill. James talked about these facts in a non-linear way. It's not like he got the story and then he told the story. Little bits and pieces, disconnected from each other, came out over a long period of time, and way before he was able to read. And the stuff was not in books, as I said. It was hard to find. It took years of research for his father to verify it all. So, Dr. Tucker wrote the next chapter, investigating cases of children with past life memories. He took over for Dr. Stevenson, who said that there's just mounting evidence for ESP, and the evidence was getting harder to ignore and really difficult to explain away, which is bad science. You know, you're looking for evidence. You just don't dismiss it because you don't like it. Can't explain it. So Dr. Tucker wrote an article, Scientists with Half-Closed Minds. And he said a high number of scientists are very scared of new ideas. He did extensive study of cases, and he had 44 cases of children under the age of 10, most under the age of 3 or younger, from all over the world that were the cream of the crop of cases to document. And he got a grant to look at one case in India, and when he went over there and people heard what he was doing, he ended up with 25 cases. He ended up taking his time and going to Sri Lanka and Alaska, too. We talked about these cases in one of our last books. In India, he spoke with a 3.5-year-old named Kumkum Verma, who remembered life as a woman in a village 25 miles away. And they were eventually able to confirm 18 facts this kid remembered. Children usually will talk about, if they have memories, they'll usually talk about spontaneously about past lives until they're about 35 months old. And they mostly remember nondescript lives. These children are not imagining that they were Joan of Arc or Napoleon or Julius Caesar or Marilyn Monroe. You know, they're not remembering auspicious, august pasts. They were villagers living in poverty, or they were peasants, or they were indentured servants. I mean, very, very, very few remember beautiful lives of wealth and fame. 70% of these children who remember something had a traumatic death in their past life. Dr. Fenwick talked about that. And with the children, with the traumatic past life death, the past life is usually quite recent. Kids often have what they call behavioral memories. They act like the dead person, mannerisms. They'll cry that they miss certain people from their former life. They'll have nightmares and phobias. 35% have an intense fear of the mode of their past death. So, in 52 cases of past drowning, 43 were terrified of water in the new life. And I'm just going to use these terms rather than constantly qualifying them and saying it, assuming, as allegedly. Just going to talk about it. It's easier. A girl in Sri Lanka named Shamlini Prema hated being put in water from the time that she was born. And it would take 3 adults to hold her down for a bath, which is kind of disturbing. At about 6 months, she also began displaying a great fear of buses. When she became old enough to talk, she described the life of a girl in a nearby village who died a year and a half before Shamlini was born. The girl in the previous life had been walking along a narrow road when a bus came by. As she tried to get out of its way, she fell into a flooded paddy field next to the road and drowned. Oftentimes, as with drawing pictures to deal with trauma, children will act out the death of their past life. And James did that, trying to get out of the burning plane to parachute. Dr. Stevenson argued that the development of the human personality may actually include the combination of genetics and environment and past life. We say nurture and nature, but there might be a third factor, past lives. People are born with birthmarks and birth defects. from what they claim was their form of death or an accident in their past life. For example, Kenai, a Thai boy, when he was 3, he said he'd been a school teacher and that he'd been shot riding his bike to school. And he died, and he had many details about it. And they looked at his scalp, and he had 2 scars, an entry wound and an exit wound. In a nearby town, for some reason, they got on a bus to go to this nearby town, not common to them. And when they got off the bus, he was with his grandmother, and he led her to a house and said that this was the home of the school teacher that he used to be. And he had these 2 birthmarks that corresponded perfectly with an entry and exit wound. Dr. Stevenson found 18 cases of double birthmarks in kids who claimed to remember being shot. Other kids were born with deformities and had these strange stories. One little boy was born with abbreviated digits on one hand, and from the time that he could barely talk, he said that he had been working. He described the job that he was doing, I forget now exactly what it was, and as an adult, and it had accidentally cut off his fingers. One child was born with a strangely misshapen head, kind of flat on one side, and a missing ear. And he claimed that he had been shot. What killed him is he was shot, and it took his head and ear. So they have 400 documented cases of this. And he wrote this huge book called Reincarnation in Biology. The physical sequelae, that's like the stuff that happens as a result of something, from traumatic death of past life. And mental images do cause physical changes in the living. For example, perfect example, stigmata, Padre Pio. I saw the monastery where he came from. They're really into him. He claimed, well, people saw the wounds in the hands and feet and side of Jesus at his death, and there's a psychological explanation for it. So because there's a psychological explanation that does affect these sorts of weird physical changes, it could happen to the fetus. One in a girl in Sri Lanka, this is about kids recognizing people from their past. One girl in Sri Lanka recognized many people from the past and knew odd private details about their lives. When she met with the people, they took her to this strange village. They'd never been there. They didn't know who these old people from the old life were, but they decided to placate her, and they went. It's my uncle. It's my cousin. And then they'd try to introduce her to somebody, and she'd say, I don't know you. And it was true. The dead little person never met that one. They were trying to trick her. So they documented 79 American cases in 1983. And all these children who claimed this past life experience were tested. They had no psychiatric issues. They proved to have high IQs and high verbal skills. No emotional issues. So this is the start of another chapter, and I think what I'll do is I'll stop now. This is a good time to stop on the time limit, and we'll start with video 2 at chapter 4. And I hope you're enjoying this. I find this absolutely fascinating, so hope you're joining me and enjoying it. And Slan, I'll see you in a minute.